Hello there. Here's hoping that all is well with you from wherever you are watching us right about now. My name, as always, is Eugene Anangwe. This is In Focus. The hashtag, as always, is In Focus RW, the program where we get to put on the spotlight several burning issues and, of course, current affairs issues. We had announced earlier that we'll be talking about gambling and the craze of sports betting, but noting that we have guests around in town, we're not going to gamble or bet when they're around. We'll have this conversation next time. But being a current affairs oriented program, we have changed that particular topic, and tonight the focus is on the African Union reforms, plus of course a host of other issues as far as multi-party democracy in Africa is concerned. Now, in 2016, President Paul Kagame at the African Union Summit that was held right here in Rwanda was given the task of spearheading reforms to the African Union. And of course, today and throughout this couple of weeks, the president has been busy with his team of experts meeting those who are in charge of spearheading these reforms. And we'll be talking about these particular reforms right here. And these are some of the statements that the president has been making. And one of them is that we need to accelerate the decision to finance the African Union with the levy on eligible imports. Everything else flows from this, and we cannot afford to get bogged down. He's also made another statement, which is just going to appear on your screen also just shortly, concerning the issue of financing. And there it is. We need to accelerate the decision to finance the African Union. This is something that the president has also been making. And so on the program tonight, these are the things that we're going to be focusing on right here, plus a host of other issues. I'll be introducing my panelists right here on the program. Stay with us. Right, Dr. Golooba, thank you so much for joining us on the program. You're not new to this particular television, probably new to this particular show, but in another life, we've been together on several occasions. Now, we're going to talk about a host of issues, but of course, starting off is the focus of the over 50 foreign affairs ministers who are in town or who have been in town to meet on the African Union reforms that have been proposed by President Paul Kagame and his team of experts. It's important for us to first understand the need for these reforms before we even start pointing one by one these particular reforms. Are things that bad in the AU that we say that, okay, it's time to put our house in order? Or what would you say concerning this particular area?
The background to this is the Organization for African Unity, which is the predecessor of the AU. Now, for those who are old enough, it's not too long ago that we were dismissing the OAU as a club of dictators.
Yes.
The OAU had degenerated into a talking shop where our presidents would retreat to have to talk to themselves and then come out and make big statements until the next summit. So there was a generalized sense that the OAU wasn't really serving any purpose. So sometime in the 90s, I think, if my memory serves me right, we got a group of new presidents who thought that it was time to rethink what the OAU should be about, or what an organization of African states should be about. And three presidents were particularly active on this. I think it was Abdoulaye Wade, it was Thabo Mbeki, and Bouteflika. And so they came up with a whole range of issues regarding how ineffective the OAU had been and how there was a need to reinvent this organization and produce something much more effective. So
and that's
how the African Union was born.
Yes.
And the African Union was born amidst a great deal of optimism. It was going to be a different kind of organization. You remember all the talk about the new the new economic partnership for African development, NEPAD. You remember the Africa pure Africa peer review mechanism where presidents would meet and talk to each other frankly, where countries were supposed to volunteer to be assessed along a rather long list of criteria. But the main thing was good governance, whether countries were measuring up to what NEPAT or what the AU had identified as elements of good governance. Now, incidentally, Rwanda was very quick to volunteer to be assessed. A few others did the same, but it didn't go very far. And I think that I don't remember when the last time I heard of these assessments is, but it's not recent, it's a long time ago. So there has also been a sense of, in the last few years, that even the AU was drifting in the same way that the OAU had been drifting.
Right.
Member countries are not paying up their subscriptions.
They're still looked as a club of, you know...
not in the same way that the OAU was looked at,
yes.
But I think that there has been agreement that the AU hasn't really lived up to expectations. And I think the height of this happened during the time when civil war broke out in Libya, and when the world was asking themselves how to react to it. And you might remember that a number of African presidents said that it would be preferable for Africa to address that matter. The AU kept quiet for a while until the Western countries intervened, and then it took a while before the AU came up with its own position on the matter. And I think from that time on there was a feeling in Africa that, you know, this thing is not working. It's not serving us in the way that we expected it would serve us. So it's maybe time to look at it again.
Right.
And so that's the broad context within which these reforms are being suggested and are being pursued.
Let's talk about what the mandate or the task that President Paul Kagame has when it comes to, you know, spearheading this. Because, as you said, from the OAU to AU, there must have been someone who had been given the baton to spearhead those reforms. And as you said, there was still, you know, a failure in actually achieving those desired outcomes. What could be running through the mind of President Paul Kagame when it comes to wanting to see the completion and the success of these proposed reforms?
Well, the broad story with President Kagame as far as Africa is concerned is that he has been talking quite constantly about the need for Africa to do things differently, the need for Africans to look for their own solutions to problems for which we actually have solutions. It's just that I think we Africans have become a bit lazy about solving our own problems because we get too much assistance easily, which assistance doesn't help us to think creatively about how to deal with these issues ourselves. And I think that Rwanda has led the charge for Africans thinking, first of all, of how to solve their own problems before they appeal for external assistance. And I would presume that it's because he has been using that language for a long time that his peers noticed that here is somebody who is saying something interesting. Maybe he can help us begin to think about how to make the AU effective. But there's also, of course, the story of Rwanda's recovery since the genocide against the Tutsi. As you know, hardly anyone expected Rwanda to recover from the genocide. So Rwanda has recovered, contrary to expectation. And it has recovered very fast. And there is a great deal of soul searching outside Rwanda as to how Rwandans have managed to do this. So when other Africans visit Rwanda and they have a look at how Kigali looks, and they have a look at how effectively the government here functions, there is a sense that there is something extraordinary happening here.
Right. But
I think that was also an incentive for them to say, look, you've done all these things, you've done them miraculously.
We want you to
maybe
infect us with that good disease.
You could help us with this too.
Yeah, but the challenge, Golooba, is that you know, the issue of learning from one another, which has been something that you know, these regional blocs have always yearned to achieve, is seen not to be very effective. You know, you say that when they come to Kigali and they see the cleanliness, they go back to their countries and they're like, you know, you seem to be different, help us get there. But let's even move away from just the African Union and this task that President Kagame has. Many leaders have been coming to Rwanda and they have seen the cleanliness. They have gone to visit the genocide memorial at Kisozi. But how many of them have replicated what they've seen in their countries? This goes to ask the question of, yes, they have put President Paul Kagame there because of the success story of Rwanda, but how many are ready to learn? How many are ready to implement? How many are ready to be different, and achieve these proposed reforms?
It's difficult to know how many are willing to change or how many would like to emulate what is happening here. That's one thing. The second is the degree to which what is happening here can be replicated elsewhere. For those of us who study Rwanda, we think that there are certain things, certain aspects of Rwanda's transformation over the last 2 decades that can be copied quite easily. There are others that are really quite difficult, that have to do with the culture of Rwandans, that have to do with the way Rwandans are, that have to do with the way Rwandans see themselves and see the world. Transformation is very political. And many African leaders have very unique problems in their own countries, so that you just don't wake up one day and say, for instance, and say, you know what, we are going to do Muganda every last Saturday of the month. In some countries that can be politically very difficult. And I presume a country like your own, Kenya, with all the noise, all the civil society groups, freedom, this liberty, this freedom, that. I don't think that that is something that can be easily replicated. But having said that, I'm aware there have been African presidents who have come here, admired what is happening here, come back again and again, and who I understand are trying to do a few things as they're done here. The new president of Benin is one of them. I understand when Idris Deby first came to Kigali and he saw all the cleanliness, he went back and wanted Chadians to do the same thing. I understand that President Alpha Conde, when he came here, he aspired to do the same thing. I understand the president of Gabon is copying some aspects of what is happening here. I think that there are certain things they're going to learn from Rwanda and try to do them. There are others that I think realistically are going to be difficult to copy.
Let's delve into these proposed reforms. One of them is very key, and it's seen to be as the major reform of all of them, and that was the enabling of the African Union to finance itself in the long term. And of course, when you look at this particular issue of self-financing, the latest statistics were showing, or information was showing, that 80% of the budget or the running of activities of the AU are externally funded. And there's been a mechanism that has been put in place that will see, levying of a certain amount of taxes that on any, imports to go towards financing the African Union. This morning, Donald Kaberuka was mentioning or trying to explain, why people should not be worried, especially on the issue of the World Trade Organization rules of fairness when it comes to this particular mode of, sourcing of finances. How practical do you think this is going to be, especially looking at the different economies or the sizes of the economies of the different African states?
Technically, it's feasible and it's doable.
What about practically?
Practically, I think it's doable. The question for me is whether all African countries will have governments or leaders who are going to be motivated to pursue it consistently, to the extent that even those who replace them after they leave power will continue with it. I think that the problem of funding in Africa, or the problem of funding for the AU, is both, I think, a product of a certain laziness on the part of African leaders. It's probably a question of it not being a priority that is felt keenly by a certain number of African leaders. Because what happens if you don't pay up? Nothing happens. If there was some kind of incentive attached to it, whereby if a country was able to mobilize these resources and hand them over, that they would get something in return, and that those that fail will suffer some kind of sanction.
Yes.
That might be a good incentive for people to collect the money. It's not a huge amount of tax that they're asking for, it's a small amount. The question is going to be whether countries have the mechanisms for collecting it, whether they want to have those mechanisms or whether it's a priority for them, and whether they really think that it's a good way to spend their resources. And I think that there has to be a great deal of talking intended to convince all African governments and their leaders that actually this is a critical matter for Africa.
Right.
I don't think that the word shameful actually captures it adequately, that 80% of the budget of the AU is funded by foreigners. It's not foreigners who founded the AU. The AU is not there to serve the interests of foreigners. The AU is there to serve the interests of Africa and Africans. It was founded by Africans who had a great deal of aspirations which they wanted to pursue through it. Why it's funded by outsiders, why African governments are not minded to fund it themselves, that baffles a lot of people who observe Africa, both within Africa and outside.
Yeah. And you mentioned the issue of the sanctions, and I'm just going to read through this. It's one of the recommendations on the issue of implementation that the reforms actually shines a spotlight on. And one of them includes the recommendation that deals on the issue of the challenge of implementation of past ideas that were put in place but were not implemented. And this included recommendations to constitute a heads of state level implementation supervision arrangement, which will be established as an implementation unit within the African Union's chairperson's office, and to create a legally binding mechanism that ensures that member states honor their commitments to implement these reforms. I'm sitting here wondering, what would be the possible scenarios that would take shape or place in the case when an AU member state fails to honor these commitments?
Well, I mentioned the Africa peer review mechanism earlier. The idea behind that mechanism was that there would be standards of governance that the AU would consider to be the minimum, which every African country would be encouraged to achieve. And that through the peer review mechanism, people would be assessed, or countries would be assessed, and this information would be made publicly available. Now, those that were not measuring up would, to some extent, feel ashamed about it. They would be pressurized.
Would they? Would they really feel ashamed?
Well, I think that if it's done consistently, so that if, say, you have 54 African countries, if you have 15 or 20 that are constantly being praised for measuring up, for doing everything possible to measure up, and then you have a group that are considered to be the laggards that are not doing anything about it, and it's out there in the media, I think it would have an effect.
Because
now, the question you ask there, I think the same principle would apply. That there will be countries that live up to these expectations, that collect the money, that hand it over, and there will be those that don't. So if there is some kind of committee or mechanism that is instituted that somehow decides on what kind of sanctions to institute against those that don't measure up, it could be a naming and shaming approach. It could be something else. But I think that one has to find a way of inflicting some kind of pain on those that don't measure up. And if this is done consistently, now it's the consistency that we need to really constantly preoccupy ourselves with. Is this going to be consistent? Is it going to be passed on from one leadership to the next
another,
in countries where leaders change? If that is done, I think it is going to be revolutionary. But for me, I'm not sure. I'm not going to sit here and say, look, it's going to happen. I would like to see it happen. I'm curious to see if it will happen. And I'll be extremely pleased if it does.
Because why I'm asking you this is because when you talk of the peer-to-peer review mechanism, where you name and shame or stand up against one of you who is not doing the right thing, some people argue that we haven't seen this work at all, especially when it comes to conflict, ridden or hit individual African states, where not every African Union member state has stood up with one voice against that specific. The door has always been shut, and what reads on that door is, this is a sovereign state. You cannot or should not tamper with whatever is going on within our countries. How will that issue of sovereignty stand on the way or help in the process of achieving this?
I think that it's a difficult issue. It's not an issue that we should minimize, or the importance of which we should minimize. Certainly it has stood in the way of Africa resolving a lot of problems, especially at the level of conflict. But I think what we saw happening in Gambia recently, when West African countries stood up against Yahya Jammeh and said, you know what, you lost the elections, you have to hand over power to the person who won. And we are going to make sure that you do it, whether you do it peacefully or not. If you're not willing to do it peacefully, we'll send in the forces to throw you out of there. Now, that was important in the sense that it sets a precedent. It shows that these things can happen if there is a will. But again, thinking of that particular case, I think that there were a few in-video African presidents in that region who had issues with Yahya Jammeh. And for them, that was
an opportunity,
a good opportunity to get back at him. And I understand that the president of Senegal hadn't been getting on with Yahya Jammeh for a long time. And as you could see, Senegal was at the forefront of pushing this. Now, we can criticize several elements of it, but it happened, and that shows that it can happen, where there is a will. Now, is there going to be a will? I have no idea. I hope there will be. But yes, what you're mentioning is a big problem. It has been a big problem. Will African leaders take a different approach this time around? I hope so.
Yeah, and you're keeping the hope alive. You talk of the segmentation of these regions. You've talked about, what happened in Gambia. And analysts have also argued when it comes to, economics, that the issue of segmentation of the continent is actually standing on the way of the continent as far as fully enjoying, whatever we have in terms of resources and doing business with other, intercontinental or global partners is concerned. We have SADC. We have the East African Community. All this under one Africa. Should we be talking of breaking or pulling down those walls and creating one united African market that can be able to do business with other, countries across the globe? Would this even be an option or a possibility?
I think it would be the ideal. But the issue is one of size, as far as I see it. The other issue is that even these small entities that we have created don't work very well. Now, if we can't make those small entities work well, why should we aspire to create something bigger? The East African community is touted as one of the regional blocks that work very well. But we know that internally it has a lot of issues. Not every decision that is made in the East African community is implemented. When implementation is decided upon, it doesn't happen at the speed at which it was supposed to happen. And you have all kinds of problems that creep up among our own countries. There are petty jealousies, there are nationalistic considerations. Many things come up. Now, if the East African community, which is composed of 5 countries, with one enjoying observer status, is finding these things very difficult to do. Imagine if we had a continental-wide body. The contradictions would be so many.
So it would be a bigger problem.
Even as we speak, we have this artificial division between Anglophone Africa and Francophone Africa and Lusophone Africa and so on and so forth. There is a certain difference in cultures. And until these things are dealt with, and hopefully if the AU gets to work, discussions towards breaking down these other small entities may begin. But I wouldn't think that it would make sense for us to rush into creating something big if small entities
ones are not yet
giving us so much headache to make work.
Sure. Thank you so much. We're going to take a very short break right about now. And of course, we have Enoch on Twitter. Tumuine, thank you so much. We have Emma who says, Golooba Mutebi is brilliant. He articulates issues. And I'm still expecting a lot from him tonight. Keep those tweets coming. Hashtag is InFocusRW. When we come back, let's jump a bit deeper into the multi-party democracy, plus, of course, other matters concerning Africa, right here on the program with Dr. Fred Golooba Mutebi. Stay with us.
Many people have been asking what we have been up to. Well, we have told the different stories from decision makers, but this time round it will be different. We will be getting head to head with various influencers and get to the heart of the matter. It is not an easy ride, but we'll endeavor to get you there. It will be insightful, informative, and at times we will agree to disagree because we are the bridge to your leaders.
Wonderful. So he really should not be running for president to change anything.
I think you should not say what I have not said.
Second, I have another point.
In your head.
Let me have another point. I have another point.
Yes.
He's also
I
saying,
can speak for myself. The political power in power is RPF and its coalition.
Do they need to be in power to be able to put the government in check?
no, that's just as an excuse.
No, it's not an excuse. I mean, we can make statements. We can make statements. We can make press releases about it, but we can't take it further unless maybe we can say we can.
So we accept multipartyism, we accept ruling party, we accept coalition.
We need to actually get proper legitimate after that when he competes in the election, sometime in July or August 2017, he's actually competing in a competitive process, not like in 2010 when it was maybe a victory.
But what's your point?
And welcome back. Thank you so much for still being with us. This is In Focus. My name, as always, is Eugene Anangwe. Tonight in the program, we are talking about the reforms on the African Union, plus, of course, other matters concerning Africa. And one of them is also the issue of multi-party democracy. Just as you saw during the break, next week we have round 2 of the face-offs concerning multi-party democracy here in Rwanda and looking at the model of democracy in Rwanda. We have Sheikh Abdul Karim, who will be going head-to-head with Gonzague Muganwa. That is next week on Sunday. Today on the program we have Golooba, who's Dr. Fred Golooba Mutebi, who is a researcher. Thank you so much for still being with us on the program.
My pleasure.
Let's shift gears a bit and look at this other issue that you spoke about, whether new leaders who come in will still have, the oomph to continue on these reforms that are being proposed. And we all know that the continent is going through an electioneering period. Kenya, just next door, August 8th, will be going for elections. And if you read the mood of the elections there, also Rwanda will go for elections in August. If you read the mood, for example, in Kenya, and the manifestos and the rhetorics that go on over there, do you sense any feeling of any concern about the African Union and what they would have as their agenda in unifying the continent in any way?
Let me begin where you began, which is the question of whether if one government, say in country X, takes the reform agenda of the African Union seriously, would its successor government do the same? Now, there are very few grounds for optimism on things of this kind in Africa, and that's because I think that we have allowed ourselves to get carried away with this issue of democracy without really understanding what this issue is taking us or should take us. We like changing governments. We like doing it in a noisy manner where in some countries people beat each other up. They crack each other's skulls, break each other's legs, and so on and so forth. And these countries are cheered by outsiders. They call these democracies. It's democracy because people are competing and so on and so forth.
So what are you trying to imply?
This democracy distracts us from addressing serious issues. Because one of the biggest weaknesses that we have in Africa is that in almost all our countries, we have not identified and agreed on what our values are. We have not agreed on things that every government should take seriously as key national issues that should never be changed or distorted by whichever government comes to power. Now, this happens in mature democracies. If you went to the United States, there are things that the major parties will disagree about, but there are things on which they will rally together.
But this is the model we have in Rwanda.
We don't have this
consensus.
Well, forget Rwanda. Rwanda is a very exceptional country in these terms. Take my own country, Uganda. The discussion of democracy centers on Kizza Besigye and President Museveni. If you go to Kenya, it's Uhuru and Raila Odinga. People don't address the things that are long-term challenges for these countries, that are long-term challenges for Africa.
What would they be discussing?
What do you Kenyans, for instance, agree about as national values, inviolable values?
Harambe, the spirit of togetherness.
Well, Harambe died with Jomo Kenyatta, if I'm not mistaken. So the thing I'm saying, the point I'm trying to develop is, it's difficult to say that, look, if this happens with one set of leaders, it's going to happen with the next set of leaders. Because the next set of leaders may come and just turn everything upside down. One of the things in Africa also is that one government comes to power, appoints new leaders from top to bottom. 5-10 years down the road, that entire set of people leave, and the new set comes in.
So what are you trying to say? Are you trying to say we need to have only one?
Historical memory, consistency, continuity is not there.
Yeah.
I think that what you have in Rwanda is the kind of thing that I personally think that we should be looking at seriously. Because what you have here is a government, and I keep telling people that Rwanda does not only have a multi-party system, but it has a multi-party government. There is broad agreement among significant political elites in this country to work together to achieve or to pursue and achieve certain things which are important for the country.
But last Sunday, Dr. Fred, the leader of the Democratic Green Party was seated right where you are, and he was actually saying that there is no real power sharing in Rwanda. There is no real space for political, arguments and speaking about, political space and all that.
I'm sure that you and I know that that's not true. It's absolutely not true. To say that there is no power sharing in Rwanda, of course there is. I mean, how many cabinet ministers in this country are not members of the RPF? Senior government ministers who are free to perform their functions as any other minister who may be a member of the RPF. Go and talk to them. And I've spent several years speaking to some of these people individually to try and find out what it feels like to be a member of a party other than the RPF, to be in government as a minister. What does it actually mean? And I wouldn't agree with the leader of the Democratic Party, of the Green Party, when he says that, there is no power sharing. But also, one important thing we should note about Rwanda is that the issue is not just about power sharing. It's sharing power and responsibility. So they say power and responsibility sharing. Now the responsibility bit is very important because we have this slogan in Rwanda, the slogan "Never Again." I think that slogan carries far more meaning than most people realize. It is about Rwanda not returning to where it's coming from. Now, it's the responsibility of all major political parties in this country to ensure that Rwanda never goes back there. Now, for me, that aspiration that Rwanda should never again descend into a genocide or descend into political violence or descend into power monopoly of the kind that we used to see under the MRND or even the party before that. That is a core value, that this country matters and that it's the responsibility of everyone who aspires to lead this country to make sure that Rwanda doesn't go back. I don't see this in other countries.
The argument is when they do, contrasting and comparing, for example, if they look at Kenya, they look at Uganda. Let's take an example even of Kenya right now. Elections August 8th, in Rwanda 4th of August. If you look at the political temperatures in Kenya, as far as campaign is concerned, as far as people selling their agendas is concerned, and all the kavuyo that you can talk about when it comes to an electioneering period, and they come to Rwanda, they feel a sense of quietness, and others are like, are the elections going to happen really in Rwanda? How could you, or how can you explain this or break this down to someone who has that kind of a mindset that democracy is when you see a lot of rallies going on with different political parties saying this and the others going on the other end saying that, and then the population is left now to decide on who they want.
Well, the difference, I think, lies in one country practicing what I would call textbook democracy. Democracy as it is taught in the classroom. Because, look, I'm a political scientist, and I learned the theory of democracy, and I can recite it to you. The democracy that we read about in the books is the democracy as practiced in Western liberal democracies. Now, it's very good for them because it has taken 200, 300 years to mature. We bring that back to Africa and we want to replicate it just as it is. We want to bring American democracy to Uganda. We want to bring British democracy.
If it has worked in America, why wouldn't it work in Uganda? Why wouldn't it work?
You see, there is something called context. Context matters. Our cultures are different. Rwanda, how old is Rwanda as a country, as an independent state? Just over 50 years. Same thing with Uganda, same thing with Kenya. Democracy in America has been evolving for over 200 years. Democracy in America, at the time the United States became a democracy, is not. Democracy today doesn't resemble what it did 200 years ago. It has evolved.
So as we count this evolution...
Democracy in the United Kingdom, same thing.
Yes.
But also we make a mistake, which is to think that there is such a thing as one model of democracy. No, there's different models of democracy. European countries don't have democracy or democratic systems that resemble each other, that you can superimpose on each other and they fit exactly. The United Kingdom does not have a written constitution. France has one. There are countries where they vote for their presidents or prime ministers directly. There are countries where they don't. We have European countries that have term limits. You have others that don't. In Africa, we are terrified of thinking for ourselves. We behave like robots. We want to copy things, cut and paste style.
But what is wrong with having alternative sort of agendas? For me to come and decide as a citizen that if you sell your agenda and manifesto and say you'll do this if you're given this vote, and then the other end, you sell your agenda which is different from this one, you give me alternative. This is how other people argue, and they say this is what we need, this is what democracy is, as opposed to having only probably one person or only two people.
Well, I think that
what would be good for the audience?
That approach is good, and it works in a context where you have strong institutions, where the leaders who are in power, it doesn't matter whether one leader is in power or not. There are institutions that mediate power relations. There are institutions. Do you know that a few years ago, Belgium did not have a government for over 6 months, and the country continued to function? Do you think that can happen in an African country? It can't. The difference is in institutions. Our institutions are very young. We ourselves haven't really understood properly what democracy is about in many cases. We have copied things that we can't make work. Now again, I'll tell you that I think Rwanda is an exception, because what you have here is the will by your political elite to experiment. Try to experiment with democracy and fashion it to fit the context. And say, you know what, Rwanda is a young country. This is where we want to go. And we can only get there if we take this bit of democracy and take this bit and reject that one and take this one. Now, the political system you have in Rwanda today, if you gave Rwanda another 100 years, if you were to be here in 100 years, I think that it is going to change by itself.
Would it change into what we already see in other countries, or will it continue evolving in the same model?
It might change. It might go in any direction. People do ask, whenever I try to explain this to people outside of Africa, and say, look, there is a consensus in Rwanda, at least for now, there is a consensus among a large group of politicians coming from different political parties, from different ideological backgrounds, that there are certain things that need to happen in Rwanda at a certain pace, and that it is the responsibility and the right of Rwandans to determine that. They ask me, but how long is that going to last? And my response is always, the Rwandans will decide how long it lasts. For now, it is serving them fairly well. If, say, in 5 years' time they decide that it's not serving them well, they will change it. After all, they're the ones who are responsible for putting the one we have now in place. They will think for themselves as they thought about putting in place the one that we have. I think that elsewhere in Africa, we are scared of thinking. We are scared of experimenting. We are scared of being daring enough to say, you know what, you have a system there that works very well in the United States, but maybe it doesn't fit very well here. We will borrow that and this and this and that, but the rest we will not bring here because the context here is not the context in the United States.
So, for example, which or what are the elements or the things that you think we have in, let's say, the Rwandan democracy or any other East African country or African country for that matter, that you feel we need to shed off? Is it going for elections and saying that whoever wins, then that's democracy, or having different people compete, or having more than one political party? Are those some of the things that you're saying we copied and we need to actually think outside of the box, or like there's no box that exists?
Now you see, for instance, in Uganda we have what we call the winner-takes-all system, where you have several parties competing. The party that wins takes everything, and those that lose completely, and they wait until the next
election.
Now, that is good at one level, but it's also quite damaging and destructive in the sense that in Uganda, political competition is a do-or-die process. People fight so hard to get to power.
Into power, yes.
Because there's so much at stake. Now, Rwanda has a system of power and responsibility sharing. Under Rwanda's constitution, there are certain ways that have been determined along which power is shared.
Like the president and the speaker not from the same
So
party.
that here, political competition is not do or die. You can lose elections and still be in a position of responsibility. You can lose elections and still be a minister. A party can lose elections and still remain an influential party. Because again, you know, the National Forum of Political Organizations, where parties meet to make quite important decisions. So that is something that Rwanda has adopted, because the political elite here thought that that would be the best way of enabling this country to recover from the effects of the genocide, making sure that the turmoil of the past doesn't reoccur. Now, is this going to last 20, 40, 50 years? We don't know. But my argument will be that if Rwandans continue to think that way, they will think of what to do next. If this system comes to a point when it no longer serves their interests, or where it no longer fits their aspirations. Now, again, I'm going to emphasize to you that I see that in other African countries, we don't do that. We copy systems that are actually quite destructive. Again, Kenya and Uganda, do you know that in the run-up to elections, a lot of wealthy people leave the country? They run away.
Because they're not sure.
They're running away from democracy. The same democracy that we think is very good. Why do we run away from it? Because the democracy we are practicing over there is amenable to violence. It is amenable to destruction. In Uganda, 2 days before the elections, people go shopping as if they're shopping for Christmas, because they think that after the elections there might be violence, and so it pays for you to have food at home to last you maybe 2 weeks in case there's an explosion of violence. Here, elections pass off so peacefully that sometimes you hardly notice that people are voting. And again, they vote in such large numbers. 98% of the electorate in Rwanda votes. Tonight, the new French president has won elections by a very small percentage. And you think, what kind of democracy is that, where somebody becomes president because he won just under 40% of the vote? Other people abstained from voting, other people voted for someone else, but that person has a mandate. And some people think that that mandate is far stronger than the mandate of, say, Paul Kagame in Rwanda, who wins in the 90s. They say, oh, you know, but that is not possible. But those of us who observe elections here, we see that it's possible. So my argument would be that much as we aspire to be democratic, much as we aspire to elect our own leaders, I think it would be good for us to think in each country, and I'm not selling a model. I'm not saying the Rwanda model should work everywhere. The Rwanda model is suitable for Rwandan circumstances. My argument would be that every country, leaders or political elites in every country should sit down together in their different parties, in their different ideologies, and say, look, what are the things that are going to serve this country best that we could all do together and avoid these conflicts that force people to run away during elections, that cause mayhem after elections.
Right. In Kenya, as you mentioned, you know, the temperatures are so high, and we even saw them during the party primaries.
I was there, I saw it.
Right, and normally, traditionally, some party primaries, the results are seen as the reflection of what would happen in the end during the election itself. If you come back to Rwanda, for example, during the referendum on yes or no, whether to amend the constitution, and we saw over 90% of voters voting yes. If you're in Kenya and you're looking at the primaries and you're saying that if it happened this way, then this already reflects what is likely to happen in the general election. In the case of Rwanda, August 4th, other presidential hopefuls, do they have any, any hopes looking at the results of the referendum, the percentage of the referendum? Do they have anything to really look up for as far as hope is concerned in winning an election?
If you're asking me whether it's possible for President Kagame to be defeated in August, I think not. I think that the results of the referendum already told us who the next president of Rwanda is. And I mean, this might be a bit of sacrilege, but let me say it. I wish that Rwanda would simply carry on without an election, because the election, I think it's going to be some kind of fulfillment of a ritual that, strictly speaking, is unnecessary. Because we know that the vast majority of Rwandans have decided that they want, at least those who voted in the referendum, decided, whichever way they decided. The fact of the matter, we know how they voted. Who convinced them, what happened before that, that is no longer an issue. They decided in their high 90s and so on, that they want the president to stay in power.
But others argue that a day in politics is such a very long time. So are you trying to say that the people like Dr. Habineza, we have two who are not yet cleared to run, we don't know if they will or not. Maimana, we have Diana, who recently came up and said that she also wants to contest for the high office. I'm trying to say that they should just sit back and,
I'm not saying that. I think they have every right to contest for the presidency. I would only say that if I were them, I would not have too many hopes of winning. But of course, they have every right to contest. But as an observer of Rwandan politics, I think they stand no chance whatsoever.
They stand no chance whatsoever. No. If we look at the negative implications or the disadvantages of the model of democracy in Rwanda, that of, especially when we go to parliamentary elections, it's a question I shot last Sunday, and the argument was that we did away with constituency-based representation in parliament because of the creation of kingpins. What are the disadvantages for the citizens as far as deciding who they want to represent them and speak for them is concerned?
Theoretically speaking, and people who put up this argument are usually theoretical, it deprives the ordinary citizen of a chance to determine who represents them in parliament.
Yes.
That's a theoretical point, and it's very difficult to contest. In reality, we know it for a fact that in systems where you have constituency MPs, those MPs do not, in practice, represent the people they purport to represent.
To be representing.
Because how many decisions do they make in Parliament which they make because that is what the electorate has told them to make?
But they have something in the back of their mind that if I go back to seek for re-election, they will ask me, how many laws did you sponsor in Parliament while you are there? They at least know that I have to be accountable to those people.
Again, that's a theoretical point. It's very theoretical. Both Kenya and Uganda, where we have constituency MPs, you and I know, and I'm sure you know, I'm not asking you if you know, I'm sure you know, that people who contest and go to Parliament usually buy the votes. they don't get elected on the basis of whatever policy platforms they're presenting. People care nothing about policy.
Yeah.
People care about being given money to buy alcohol. People care about being given kilos of sugar. People care about whether Anangwe is my tribesmate or not, or whether Anangwe is my cousin. They will vote for you on the basis of whether you've given them money or not, whether you're their relative or not, whether you're their tribesman or not. And they don't give a damn what you do when you go to parliament, provided you come back and give them some money from time to time.
Right.
So in essence, in practical terms, the so-called constituency system is actually very disadvantageous to the ordinary person whose level of understanding of actually what happens in the capital is very low. Now here, where some people, and I've heard a few people saying, we should have constituency MPs. Here, the system as it is, I think it works very well for the ordinary person. I know that there is a time in the year when MPs in Rwanda disperse to the countryside and hold meetings in communities to listen to what the ordinary people are saying. And this applies to members of the lower house as well as senators. They visit the countryside. They listen to people. They come back and write reports and call ministers and talk to ministers and report on what they have found.
So they're still killing the same bird with the same stone.
Well, they're killing a much bigger bird in Rwanda than they do in Uganda and Kenya.
Right. The theme song tells us that we need to start wrapping up. Of course, I'm going to finish off with this tweet right here from Rutembe, who says that I'm very much sure that the team is cooking something healthy for Africa. Let's support. This is in relation to the meeting that has been going on right here. So in closing, very briefly, do you see any hopes as far as full implementation of these reforms is concerned?
I wouldn't be so optimistic. I would like to be hopeful that it will happen. But given the history of Africa, given the history of the OAU before the AU, which we have now currently, I can only be guardedly optimistic. But I really do hope that these things will happen, because we Africans should stop depending on outsiders to fund things that we can fund for ourselves, which requires simply imagination and nothing else.
Asante sana. Thank you so much. Of course, thank you also for watching and for tweeting. And it's a wrap from us right about now. We want to remind you, next Sunday, it's our second installment of the conversation on the model of democracy right here. And of course, this time round, we have a member of the ruling party, that is the RPF, will be on the set with us. And of course, together with an analyst, and that is Gonzag Muganwa, who will be joining us on set next week on Sunday. Thank you so much for tweeting. Of course, Innocent Asante, on that, you say great insights from Dr. Fred Golooba, very well articulated. From me, right here in studio under the production team, thank you so much for watching. My name, as always, is Eugene Anangwe. Goodbye for now.